I'm Nick Knudsen, joined by Will Miles. Welcome to Stand Up and Holler. In this episode, we'll recap a relatively uneventful National Signing Day, take a look at the potential market for spring quarterback transfers, another early big-time get for this class of 2024, and the spring game has been released. The date has been released. Again, we're going to see it on another Thursday night. We'll get to that in a dollar, though. Will, let's jump right into National Signing Day here for two bits. Napier had a press conference to discuss everything. And in case anybody was wondering, the first non-NIL question came just over 10 minutes into the press conference. So quickly recapping that part, even though there wasn't much to recap, the phrase is a fluid situation. NIL is a fluid situation, and I can't comment on that. We're used quite a bit from Billy Napier, but it did not stop our friends in the media from getting after it and asking a lot of questions around this similar topic there with Rashada. So he didn't say much about NIL overall. He made a couple comments about the current structure. He said the current structure of NIL and the third-party reps is very fluid. Again, using that phrase, and he believes that NIL will be and is a strength for the Gators. He did not, or rather would not, said he could not address the Rashada situation directly, but he did make a point to state that he has confidence in the leadership and the strategy within the building. He also mentioned that a lot of college football coaches are frustrated with the fluidity of NIL. He called NIL all of the bad with the NFL system with none of the good, which I like that because it's kind of true. It's permanent free agency in some senses. So I do understand him on that. But he said he believes the market will settle down eventually, which I also think is a good take there by Billy Napier. But on to the class. Well, first off, Will, let's chop it up there. We'll talk about the class itself next. But quick thoughts on that NIL subject there.
Yeah, I mean, so not a surprise that he couldn't say anything there, right? I mean, there's lawyers involved, and Florida's going to have to be quiet regardless. And plus, Napier's not supposed to know what's going on there anyway. I'm sure he does, but he's not supposed to. And so him commenting probably not the best thing in the world. I would say I don't agree with him that NIL is going to settle down, at least not from the standpoint of the top 30 players, who's really what we're talking about when we talk about sort of the shortcomings in this particular class and Florida's classes for the past decade, is those guys in the top 30, those 5-star guys, bringing in 4, 5, 6 of those guys. I don't think it's going to calm down because I think supply and demand dictates that place is going to continue to stay relatively expensive. And again, I sort of look at it, and a couple of weeks ago, we talked about him making comments about, that Florida wasn't going to get into bidding wars, and was that going to motivate people? Well, now you have sort of the same thing. We say, hey, everything's going to calm down, and that's not how you get people to invest in stuff. So we need to work on our fundraising language when it comes to this a little bit. And then the only other thing I would say is that it's a fluid situation for everyone. That's absolutely true. But, there are advantages when you have a system like the NFL, but free agency every year. And, there are disadvantages as well. And you got to find the edges. And I think that's one of the things you think about Texas A&M 2 years ago, bringing in that monster class. Some of it has fallen apart, but even then, that's still a monster class, even with the guys who've left. And that was them taking advantage of a system before anyone else was taking advantage of a system, right? They outbid people early on when it wasn't popular to get into bidding wars, and were able to take advantage. This year, A&M fell right back to where they've been every other year when Jimbo Fisher's been there on the recruiting trail, as Alabama, Georgia, and Clemson and Ohio State and all the big boys started to catch up in terms of what you needed to do. So, look, there's no crying in football. Georgia's not going to take it easy on us. Alabama's not going to take it easy on us when they get it out there on the field, irrespective of whether their NIL coffers are bigger. It's the reality of football now. So yeah, it's a fluid situation, but that's why you're paid $7 million, is to manage those fluid situations and come out and prove to all of us that it's a talent acquisition business. And Billy Napier's going to have to do that. Now, we'll talk 2024 class off to a very, very good start, but 2023 class, not exactly the bump class we were all looking for.
Some lessons learned in 2023. Let's move on here to talk about the actual classes coming in. But first, a tweet from Josh Pate of 24/7 Sports. He said the SEC collectively has signed 102 of the top 247 recruits this cycle. That's more than the Pac-12, Big Ten, and ACC combined. Wow. That's you talk about our competition not really taking it easy on us, Will. That's quite a stat there from Josh Pate.
Well, I mean, it's also why you have to recruit in this conference, right? That
Right.
that that the level of talent in the SEC is higher than anywhere else. And even when you play a team like Vanderbilt, you're going to be playing a team that, with Clark Lee there and Barton Simmons there, they're in the top 35, top 40 now every year from a recruiting perspective as well. And that's kind of where, teams like Iowa and Wisconsin sit. So that's your, like, the worst team in the SEC East is recruiting with teams that we think of as like perennial Big Ten contenders. Iowa and Wisconsin, make it to the Big Ten championship game. They don't usually beat Ohio State when they get there, but they'll snipe Michigan every once in a while and those sorts of things. That's Vandy, right? So then you got Arkansas, Ole Miss, Auburn, South Carolina. South Carolina has more five stars than Florida does in this cycle. So, there is a huge arms race in the SEC, and everybody is kind of clustered up in one big ball after you get past, Georgia, Alabama, and LSU. And it's going to be interesting to see how that works out over the next few years with Freeze coming in, with Kiffin sticking at Ole Miss, and with Brian Kelly coming in there at LSU along with Napier here at Florida.
So Napier was eventually able to get to the actual recruiting class. And the highlight of the day, there wasn't many with the early sign day. You and I were texting about it and reminiscing. And this is how you know you're starting to get old, Will. We were reminiscing about the good old days with those February signing days where they were actually like a lot of fun. It was stacked from start to finish on ESPN with the day. Lots to look forward to during the day. Now it's a few holdovers of guys who didn't sign, maybe guys who were committed but ended up flipping, signing eventually type of thing. So not as much drama on this signing day, but really represents the end of the calendar year, turn it over to the next cycle now more than anything. But we did have Caden Jones, the four-star offensive tackle from New Orleans, most notable name to sign on that day, the last recruit really that was not a walk-on to actually sign with the Gators. Napier was asked about Jones in the presser. He said, we had Caden at a camp, so we had an opportunity to work with him at 6'7.5". He's got a 36-inch arm. I mean, it's probably the longest arm we've measured since we've been doing it. And he's really young man too, a guy that I believe is going to continue to grow. He summed up the offensive line as a whole as one of the areas that they did their best work in. Significant height, length, and functional movement. Will, we talked about, of course, with the transfers coming in last week as well. Really a position of strength despite the losses. I really think this is going to be a solid position for the Gators here in 2023.
I mean, we'll see. I think that the transfers specifically maybe make you think that way. But Goodwin has a lot to prove. Keontae Goodwin, one of the transfers who came in. Certainly Najee Harris, Caden Jones, Bryce Lovett, and Roderick Kearney. Kearney and Harris are probably the top two guys that you look at, and those are interior guys. Look, Florida's losing 80% of its offensive line, maybe 60% if you consider that Austin Barber was the right tackle there towards the end, and that's one of the reasons why Tarquin transferred out. But still, you've lost four of your top six offensive linemen, and then you got Cameron Waits go down with an Achilles injury. There's not a lot of continuity there. And if you think about what Florida has had over the last couple of years, Florida's been able to run the ball in both 2021 and 2022. I mean, we can all remember Florida coming back on the strength of its running game against Alabama a couple of years ago when they only lost by 2 there. They've been able to run the ball. They've had a quarterback who's been able to run the ball. They've had a quarterback who's been able to protect the offensive line, but they've had a lot of continuity on that offensive line. Kingsley Eggleton, Ethan White, and Richard Garage have basically been stalwarts there on the left side of the line. When White went out last year, the running game went downhill, and in the bowl game, when Osiris Torrance wasn't there, all of a sudden the running game went downhill. So I'm not ready to say we're going to be the best rushing team in the SEC again. I certainly think that the guys that they brought in are going to help and going to be able to fill roles. And certainly you think about Mazuka there at the guard, he's going to be able to come in and start right away. The transfer from Baylor. Goodwin is sort of a really high end guy that they brought in from Kentucky, who may turn out to be an elite left tackle, but it may take some time to get there. And then George, the tackle that they brought in, who was a backup at Alabama, knows what it takes to play at a Power 5 level. And you're at least going to have a guy who can start when you bring in a guy like George. But can he be an elite guy? I think the answer is probably no, because if he was an elite guy, he would have been playing at Alabama. So they have solid players there. I'm not counting on anybody from the transfer portal to turn into a star. And I think, 4 offensive linemen is what you need in a class. That's what they've got in this class. Like 4 is the minimum. You'd like to see 4 or 5 most of the time. They hit their minimum. And so, we'll see. I think 2 of these guys really need to turn out. And one of them probably needs to be good, if not next year, then in 2024, for us to really start talking about, the offensive line and what they've gained. From a physical perspective, yeah, they've got a lot of skill there. But, we said this from the start. A guy like Samson Okunlola would have really been like the cherry on the top for this class on the offensive line. They didn't get that done. So it's a good offensive line class, not necessarily a great one.
Yeah, a lot of potential. Starting to fill the cupboard up there, where it's a position that after the 2022 season, it was looking kind of bleak for a few weeks there, but they quickly addressed it to at least give it a shot to develop and maybe to potentially be a source of strength again for this team here. An inside linebacker, he said Billy believes that we met our need there. Taraja Mitchell, he did mention that he was voted a team captain at Ohio State. Big deal to Adam from a leadership and maturity standpoint as well. Napier noted, look, that Ohio State team in 2021, that defense did struggle quite a bit. So it was by no means an elite defense up there in Columbus in 2021. But Mitchell is a big time prospect, and we have not had that traditional. I know Ventrell Miller could do a good job filling in on the run gap and on some of the runs and everything, but I do believe that Mitchell is more of that traditional size at that inside linebacker position, and I think that he'll give us a little extra thump there in the middle of this year potentially.
Yeah, well, I mean, we'll see. So I think, look, they only signed Jaden Robinson at linebacker for this class. Napier talked about edge, and edge is really thin when you think about Powell Ryland, and then you got Jack Piber and TJ Searcy is the only other 2 guys on the edge position. So he talked about being comfortable in the middle. I think you can see that with Mitchell. You can see that with Manny Nunnery a little bit. You can see that with Deuce Spurlock is sort of the high potential guy who's young, has a lot of games left in him, and you're going to be able to get a lot out of him. But here's the reality: Derek Wingo is hurt and has had some surgeries. So, we'll see whether he's ready to go. You got Shamar James, who played a lot last year at linebacker, but, wasn't, I mean, he was good, but he wasn't great. He was good enough to be an
young guy, made his share of mistakes, but young
made his
guy.
share of mistakes, but still,
Right.
I mean, young guy out there, got experience. You're relying on him to take that step from being an all SEC freshman player to being an all SEC player. If Shamar James steps into that role and can be an all SEC player, then Mitchell doesn't have to be fantastic. If James just sort of stays stagnant and stays right where he was, well, then Mitchell or Nunnery or Spurlock or Scooby Williams or Jaden Robinson or Derek Wingo have to step into that role as a star. It's been a long time since Florida's had a star at the linebacker position. I mean, Brandon Seiler, maybe. I mean, that's Brandon Spikes. I mean,
you're going way back on that.
Yeah, I mean, when's
Spikes
the last
was
time?
after Seiler.
Yeah, well, when's the last time we had him? Well, I guess
That's some
probably
good linebackers through the
Antonio
last
Morrison.
decade. Morrison was
Antonio
good.
Morrison is
Yeah.
probably the last guy who I looked at and said that guy does everything a linebacker needs to do in the middle of the field. I'm sure I'm missing somebody, but David Reese was limited when it came. He was a great run stopper, but he was limited when it came to going sideline to sideline. And every linebacker that Florida sent out there through the McElwain and the Jared Davis. Jared Davis is the last guy.
Another good one.
Say.
Another good
So,
one. Yeah.
But again, basically, ever since Will Muschamp's guys left town, the middle linebacker has been limited in terms of what he's been able to do, and the linebackers in general have been limited in terms of what they can do. So, I'm thinking that Nunnery is going to bring a lot of athleticism to the position. I'm thinking Mitchell is going to bring a lot of athleticism to the position that hasn't been there. Certainly, Jaden Robinson had, I think, like over 100 tackles in high school last year, but I'm looking at this saying I think Shamar James needs to be the star. Like, he needs to make that leap. And until he makes that leap, the linebackers are probably going to continue to be a weak spot, especially because Taraja Mitchell only has 1 year of eligibility left. So if it turns out that he's sort of like an above average linebacker, well, you lose Mitchell after next year and you're sort of back to starting at square one again.
Next position here at running back, he mentioned that Carroll. We talked about Carroll last week, though. Perfect piece to the puzzle that brings special teams value as well. Basically talked about the fact that they are pretty loaded at the running back room, and Carroll's just a right guy. He's got that 1 year of eligibility left. Nice fit for the year here. In addition, Will, last final notes here on signing day. Florida also added 5 walk-ons. Quarterbacks, Jordan Guile, Parker Lizzie. I believe he played at IMG. I think I saw an interview with Brandon Olson over there at Locked On Gators. He had them on the show. From Kansas, actually knew Graham Mertz and has worked with Graham Mertz before. Running back and son of Senator Marco Rubio, Anthony Rubio was a walk-on, and edge rusher Lane Swafford. Look, Will, I know these guys aren't going to generate a lot of attention, but again, building that depth in the walk-on program is just another aspect to building this program up across the board here. So you can't overlook these additions as there's been storylines across college football all the time where a walk-on comes up and eventually can be a contributor.
Well, I mean, look, I think if you're relying on preferred walk-ons, you're probably going to have an issue. But every once in a while, you hit gold and you get a Stetson Bennett or something like that who comes in and can contribute. Some of those guys who are preferred walk-ons are like 3-star guys ranked like, 15, 16, 1700 overall.
Other
those
scholarship
are guys,
offers.
yeah, and have other scholarship offers. So you're getting good players, and having that level of competition is good. That's a place where NIL might really actually be making a difference, right? That can you get an NIL deal through the collective as a preferred walk-on that essentially allows you to have a scholarship to some degree. I don't know details of that, but I can envision a scenario where that might happen. The other thing is that you got a lot of COVID year stuff going on at some of the lower level colleges where guys are staying for an extra year. And so there's probably some spots where you look at the depth chart if you've got a scholarship offer and say, I'd rather go be a preferred walk-on someplace else. Look, at the end of the day, this recruiting class is ranked 14th overall in the country. There aren't any 5-stars in it. I wrote an article a couple of weeks ago that talked about, the psych standard and those sorts of things. And we talked, we talked early on in the process about all the guys who were close to the state of Florida. And I went back and looked at the spreadsheet I had together for that podcast. If if Napier had just gotten 25 players within 150 miles of Gainesville, the players he wanted, he would have had 3 5-stars, 7 top 100, 5 guys ranked 101 to 200, 5 ranked 201 to 300. And then the point total would have been 297.39, which would have been 4th. And he would have had an average player rating of 93.2. And that didn't include any IMG players who aren't always technically from the state of Florida. We sort of assumed Cormani McLean was, a Florida guy the entire way through. That didn't happen. Then they weren't able to back that up with a guy like Desmond Ricks once he requalified. Couldn't flip Keon Keeley, who was really close as well. You had guys like Samuel Mpemba, who never really considered. You had Okunlola, who wasn't from Florida, but certainly had Florida in the final 2. Weren't able to close on him. And so, I'm looking at it saying their highest ranked player in the class is Kelby Collins, who's from Gardendale, Alabama. You look at the number of players in the top 50 from the state of Florida who went to Florida this year. There were 8 of them, but they're mostly down below the top 20 in the state. I went back and looked at Steve Spurrier's bump class back in 1991. He had 12 of the top 50 players in the state and had a bunch of guys who turned into fantastic players. So, guys like Kevin Carter, guys like Ellis Johnson, Jack Jackson, and Chris Doring was actually a walk-on. So we're talking about preferred walk-ons. Doring was a walk-on, ends up being an All-American and All-SEC. But from that, so it's really interesting because if you look at his 1990 class, there aren't any guys who made all SEC, at least on my quick glance. There are 12 all SEC seasons from Spurrier's bump class, 5 All-American seasons from that bump class. So, even back in that day where, hey, you're either going to Florida State or Miami, he was able to bring in a bunch of players from that state, from the state of Florida, and those guys turned out to be big time guys. Now, look, that doesn't mean he didn't miss on guys. Derek Brooks and Warren Sapp were both in that class in 1991. So there were some guys that even the head ball coach wasn't able to bring in. But
Florida State and Miami had some decent football players back then, and
some coaches who could recruit as well. So back in the days when NIL was something that you didn't talk about but still happened. So this is I early on, for months, I was like top 3 or bust. And I was like, top 5, it's a failure if it's not top 5. So I look at it and I say, that's where I'm at. Like, this isn't good enough. Napier knows it's not good enough. Everybody who does any of the numbers knows it's not good enough. There's a lot of good players here, and they're going to win a bunch of games at Florida. But there are only really 2 games that you care about if you're a Gator at this point, and that's October in Jacksonville, and that's December in Atlanta. And, I don't think that Florida got any closer to winning those games with this recruiting class, the recruiting class from last year as well.
So you're talking about Florida. I do like to stress this sometimes because I do think I do think it's important to note that you're talking about a championship standard here. You're talking about what it takes to be at the top, to compete with Georgia, to compete with Alabama, which is where Florida, obviously folks around the Florida program feel Florida belongs. Florida should be a championship program year in, year out, at least compete for SEC titles on a regular basis, right? That's an agreed upon thing around Gator Nation. However, did the program get better this year? Did we improve from what Napier inherited to what we're building here? Do you think that it may not have met that top 3 standard, Will, where you're calling it a disappointment in that sense, but do you feel like things are getting better overall? Do you feel like this class has enough positives in it to take the program in the right direction?
I mean, I don't think it could be worse than the 2019 class that Mullen brought in. I mean, that class had 1 star in Kyrie Elam, and then 5 starters, and a bunch of those guys didn't end up staying at Florida. So Tyron Hopper, Diabate, Naquan Wright, Tarquin, and Jadon Hill. Hill's the only guy who's still around, and none of those guys turned into stars and went to the NFL. Those guys all just transferred someplace else. Other than that, out of the blue chips, nobody else contributed. And so we can talk about Chris Steele. We can talk about Jalen Jones transferring. We can talk about Wardrick Wilson, DeAvie Hammond, and DeJuan Black not qualifying. But none of that, like, that's not what killed that class. What killed that class is guys like Chris Bogle, Keon Zipper, Lloyd Summerall, William Harrod. Like, those guys have not been major contributors at any point along the way. It's really interesting, actually. So Mullen got more production and more like what I would call elite players out of his transition class, which is really unusual. Usually you don't get that. In fact, you just heard me talk about Spurrier's class, where all the all SEC guys came from his 1991 class. Now, he had some guys who made all SEC who were there before he got there, but that transition class that he brought in really didn't have, they had a couple of guys on there who contributed, but nobody who was making all SEC out of that transition class. So now you look at the transition class for Napier last year. You got Kamari Wilson got a bunch of playing time. Chris McClellan got a bunch of playing time. ETN got a bunch of playing time. Shamar James got a bunch of playing time. If he gets 3 stars out of that, well, now you're already better than Richard Garage and Kyle Pitts, who were the stars in that 2018 class. And then you've got 17 blue chips in this class to pick from, whether it's Kelby Collins, Aiden Mizell, Jakeem Jackson, Roderick Kearney, Cameron James, Will Norman, Jordan Castell. There's a whole list of guys who you now have, we talk about this as being lottery tickets. So if 25% of those guys turn into NFL players, you're already doing better than that 2019 class that Dan Mullen brought in. So I think that's where you evaluate it in terms of how good Florida's going to be. So yeah, I think Florida got better. I think, again, it depends on, but in any walk of life, you have to say compared to what. And so Florida got better compared to where the program was in 2019 under Dan Mullen. Maybe not numbers wise. And that was sort of what my article earlier this week was about, is that if you look at the first 2 classes between Mullen and Napier, Mullen actually beats him in terms of rankings and top 100 players and top 300 players and conference rankings and those sorts of things. And that's where I get a little bit concerned, because
But as you illustrated, you just decimated the 2019 class.
Sure.
It can be ranked. We can give it a gold medal. We can call it whatever we want. It ended up being a pretty garbage class here. So does that even matter what it was ranked at that point?
No, I think it does. I mean, I think we looked at that class when it came in and said, that's not going to be good enough to beat Georgia and Alabama. And it turns out that's exactly what happened. I could say the same thing about this one. I think Florida is incrementally better. I think Florida should, with a class like this, if Napier is a decent coach on the field and decent at getting these guys to develop, should be able to beat Vanderbilt, should be able to beat Kentucky at least every once in a while, should be able to compete with Tennessee, maybe. But again, I mean, it's a question of compared to what. And I'm just setting expectations. Like, there are people who keep, every time I write an article about the recruiting, go, we just need to give Napier time. I'm like, yeah, the only way you have time is if you have realistic expectations. Because if you expect him to win a national championship with the players he's brought in these first 2 classes, I'm sorry, it's not going to happen. Now, maybe these guys participate in a national championship at some point, but essentially what this class is this is Urban Meyer's bump class without Tim Tebow, Percy Harvin, or Brandon Spikes. there were a bunch of good players in that 2006 class. But you take out Tim Tebow, Percy Harvin, and Brandon Spikes, and that 2006 team isn't winning the national championship, and that 2008 team isn't winning the national championship. It turns out that those top guys that you bring in are critical to getting things done. And there aren't, like, that's all this class is missing. If there were 3 5 stars on here, 3 top, 15 guys in this particular class, you'd be staring at a top 5 class, because those guys skew those classes so much. But the reason they skew the class so much is they are surefire starters, almost always surefire, like top first, second round draft picks. And a lot of times they turn into Heisman Trophy winners. So again, I mean, this is a class without the guy who's going to win the Heisman Trophy, right? That's essentially what I'm saying. Because if Harvin had been able to stay healthy, he probably would have had a shot at the Heisman. And then Tebow does win the Heisman, is like top 6 in the Heisman voting, I think, all 3 years, maybe top 4 in all 3 years that he was a starter. So, those sorts of transcendent guys are missing from this class. We'll see. Maybe one of these guys, Kelby Collins took a big step up in the rankings over the last couple of weeks. So did Jakeem Jackson. Those guys were, I think, in like the 70 and 80 range. They're now at 40 and 55. But even then, you're going to have some abnormal percentages in terms of turning into stars for this class to do much more than be supportive of another class that's coming in the future, that's going to be the drive to the national championship. And look, I think that's going to have to be the 2024 class, and that's off to a good start. And so there are 2 things are true. One is that from a ratings perspective, and I think from a quality of player perspective, Napier and Mullen's first 2 years in the recruiting trail are pretty similar. But Napier's first year was worse than his second. Mullen's first year, second year, third year, and fourth year were identical in terms of the talent that he brought in. So if Napier can continue to build in 2024, then essentially he has been able to sort of break that stalemate that McElwain and Mullen had, where they were just kind of sitting in the same place. Now everyone else in the SEC is trying to build too, right? Hugh Freeze at Auburn isn't just going to sit there at 17th and be like, I'm happy being there. And this is why I say I don't think NIL is going to settle down, because I think the people in Auburn are going to be happy to pony up to beat Nick Saban for the 5-star Saban's going after. That's going to drive up the price for everybody. And so we got to be prepared. The SEC is a monster when it comes to recruiting for a lot of different reasons. And NIL is just going to be one more reason. And the whole conference is going to be in a giant arms race for those top 30 guys.
You wait until that Moneyball team makes a playoff run. It'll happen, man.
We just saw it. We saw exactly what happens when the Moneyball team makes the playoff, and they lost by about 150.
And people want to know how to copy that formula, man. They did. They will. They want to see that formula. All right. Hey, let's move on here to 4 bits, and we will get to that class we talked about. Will hinted at the class of 2024. We'll get there in a minute. But first, interesting comment from the press conference. They did ask Napier about Graham Mertz. Napier had nothing but good things to say. He's absolutely been fantastic so far. He proven his work ethic in every part, the training room, the nutrition, the film study. He said, although after that statement, they followed up, asked about a transfer quarterback. He did not rule out bringing in another quarterback in the spring.
His eyes lit up. His eyes lit up when they asked
if an opportunity presents itself. And so that got me thinking, Will. It got me thinking, because I'm getting into a mode where I'm starting to think about 23, and my Graham Mertz acceptance is coming on, and certainly you guys had a nice episode over on Gators Breakdown, analyzing Graham Mertz and everything. And we're seeing the optimistic points of view, and folks from Wisconsin are coming on telling us what a great guy he is. But I think we'll still be looking for a quarterback if the opportunity presents itself, as Billy Napier said. Let's look at some of the quarterback races from around the country. I'll read you off a few races here. We'll see if there's anybody that jumps out at you. All right. So at Georgia, you have Carson Beck going up against Brock Vandergriff and Gunnar Stockton. Ohio State, Kyle McCord versus Devin Brown. Alabama, Jalen Milroe versus Ty Simpson. Let's go with those 3 first.
I mean, look, I think it would be awesome to steal a 5-star quarterback away from Georgia and then go beat Georgia with him. Vandergriff had an unbelievable profile as a high school player. And I think, Carson Beck actually was somebody who didn't necessarily impress me with his high school statistics or his film. But so if Beck beats out Vandergriff, maybe that says something about Vandergriff more than it does Beck. We'll see. But I think you'd be happy if either of those guys came loose to be able to steal them for a lot of different reasons. One of which is you'd be able to point at Kirby and say, "Hey, we're going to beat you with your old quarterback," which would be kind of fun. Um, I think Alabama. I would suspect that Milroe is probably going to lose that battle, and we saw what he could do. He was limited in terms of what he could do for Alabama. I mean, he was able to win a game for him when Bryce Young went down. At the same time, he was limited, and I like yes, he has talent and he can run the ball, but I think you're going to run into a lot of the inconsistency issues that you had with Anthony Richardson last year if you have somebody like him. And then who were the quarterbacks at Ohio State?
McCord versus Devin Brown.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's sort of the same thing. You talk about like Ohio State, and they brought Jack Miller in a year ago. Miller was somebody who's competing in that room. These guys, neither one of them. I mean, obviously CJ Stroud has gotten the lion's share of all the snaps, but again, high profile guys. I'd have to go back and look at those guys' high school profiles because I'm not entirely clear on where
McCord,
they've
I
lined
believe,
up.
was a
But
5-star prospect. He was one of the five, I think, because they had Stroud, McCord, and Ewers at one point in the quarterback room, and I believe Brown came in last year as a 4-star
yeah,
prospect.
so I mean, look, I mean, I think there's some high profile battles, but nothing where there's like where there's some incumbent who's getting pushed by a young guy, and the incumbent was really good. Like, so the kind of example I'm thinking about is that would never happen these days is when Jalen Hurts and Tua were going at it at Alabama. Tua wins the battle and Hurts sits behind him for a year before he goes to Oklahoma. That's not going to happen now. Is there a place where a big time 5-star guy's coming in is going to push the incumbent, and the incumbent, who is a really good quarterback, is going to lose because the guy behind him is a star? I don't necessarily know that exists. The kinds of things I'm looking for are the guys who are maybe a little bit, a guy like Grayson McCall, who goes in the transfer portal and then decides to stay at Coastal Carolina. You don't go into the transfer portal unless you're sort of looking for something. The question is, after spring practice, will he still be looking for something? Is that
New
somebody
coaching
who
staff up there too, so that could
yeah, I
happen.
mean, is that something that meets the evaluations of Napier and his staff? And then I think a big part of who they bring in probably has to do with their own spring practice, right? That if Mertz struggles and Miller looks like Miller's looked like, and Max Brown is still playing baseball, well, there's got to be some concern at that point, and maybe you reach for somebody who's not even one of these guys, who's like a high pedigree guy who ends up losing a battle. You're actually reaching for somebody who's kind of like Graham Mertz, because you're like, I just need a floor. Whereas if Mertz plays pretty well, and if Brown comes in and shows that he can be a competent backup, and Miller takes a step forward, well, now all of a sudden the only thing you would do is go get a guy who's like a surefire, hey, lots of experience, we're going to bring him in, and we know that he can move the ball down the field, and we're confident he'll pick up the offense quickly. So I actually think that their strategy in the transfer portal for quarterbacks will probably be dictated based on how these guys look in spring. And to be fair to Napier, and look, I've been plenty critical of the guy, but to be fair to him, he couldn't have foreseen that Jaden Rashada wasn't going to be there. Right. So their quarterback room has been set up, and their plans have all been set up with the idea that Rashada was going to be in that room, and that they were probably setting up to groom him to be the next quarterback, and that Mertz would be a good addition to help groom him along. And, you sit there and say, look, we're going to have Mertz start against Utah on the road, and we're going to work in Rashada as the year goes. If that's the plan, well, that plan blew up in their face because of all the stuff that happened with Rashada. And so now they're sort of scrambling, right? You're sitting there going, okay, we have to come up with a plan B, because our plan A, which, I mean, look, when a guy signs a national letter of intent, you assume he's going to be there and that your plan isn't going to have to change. So it was interesting. And I think not an accident that Napier basically announced to the country, yeah, we're going to be open for business in the transfer portal, and letting these guys like Vandergriff know that if they lose a battle, there's going to be a spot for you at Florida, assuming that you're building that relationship now, I'm sure through back channels,
Got got more
allegedly.
names. Got more names here for you.
All
At
right.
Ole Miss, you got Jackson Dart for Spencer Sanders, first Walker Howard. Inexplicable with the Sanders and Howard, both of them transferring there. Really, either or both transferring there with Jackson Dart still in place. Tennessee, Joe Milton versus Amaliva coming in, the highly touted recruit. I mean, Amaliva is not leaving after spring ball, but potentially Milton, I would imagine, in that situation. And Texas, Quinn Ewers versus Arch Manning might be the highest profile quarterback battle heading into 2023. Again, tough to imagine the Horns losing Ewers, or at least you give him the job to start the season, right? To keep him around, right? You got,
Well,
I would think you'd have to do that if you're Texas, but I don't imagine him losing in the spring and then heading out by fall camp to somewhere
Well,
else.
so that's sort of a great example. So Milton was a good example of what I was talking about, right? A 5-star coming in with a guy who's got some experience and has shown a pretty explosive arm. And Milton might be somebody who's available. I don't know whether you would want him, but Milton is someone who's going to be available. The other guys you mentioned, I'm pretty sure that, I mean, you get one transfer, right, without penalty. So Ewer's already transferred from Ohio State down to Texas. And then the guys who've all transferred into Ole Miss just transferred, right?
Mhm.
So I don't think they're going to be able to transfer again. So the only guy who maybe leaves is Dart, right? But didn't Dart transfer in from USC? So now you're looking at guys who are going to have to deal with the fact that that one-time transfer amnesty doesn't necessarily exist. And I'm not sure Florida's interested in bringing in a guy who's going to have to sit out for a year if they do decide to transfer when they've got DJ Lagway coming in next year. So, you're going to have to find the right fit, the right evaluation, and the right situation in all these cases. Again, I don't know what the rule is actually anymore about what happens if you decide to transfer
I think
again, but
grad transfer is different. You get to use I think there's one. I think there's one time where you don't sit during your undergrad period, and then you get a grad transfer as well. I believe.
so I'm not responsible for the transfer
Ask
portal. And
JT
so,
Daniels.
yeah, well, I mean, I don't know how that all works, but he's probably older than Stetson Bennett at this point. But
Two more schools of interest here. Will UCLA Colin Schlee, the Kent State quarterback. Look up his film. Pretty good stuff. They're up at Kent State this past year, which I believe their coach headed out. Is he the coach that went to Colorado to be the offensive coordinator for Dion, I believe.
I think so.
Dante Moore, the 5-star quarterback from Michigan that was originally committed to Oregon, flipped to UCLA, and Chip Kelly. And Ethan Garbers, another strong prospect from, I believe, the 2020 cycle, is out there at UCLA. So you would think Moore's going to be sticking around. Schlee, they're bringing in likely as a candidate, which leaves, I would think, Garbers as the guy that might hit the portal. Will again, another option there. Oregon. Not really a big QB race that you're hearing about with Bo Nix returning, but Ty Thompson, 5-star prospect from a few cycles ago. I believe this is going to be his third year. Is he really going to sit for his third year without really being the guy at Oregon? I haven't heard anything one way or another, but you would think. I'm using him as an example. As there are guys that might not be on the radar right now that may very much be available by the end of spring.
Well, again, I think this is why it's important that Napier essentially said we're open for business, right?
Yep.
That he's not allowed to go out and contact these people, but these folks are probably allowed to contact him. And so they'll have an idea of who's going to be coming, who's going to be coming open on the market. And the people who are coming on the market are going to need to know what kind of what kind of NIL deals are associated with them moving and that sort of stuff, because that's all a big part of it too these days. So I have no doubt that they're on the open market. I suspect that who they bring in is going to be tied to what Florida sees in spring practice. If they're really comfortable with Graham Mertz as the starter and they're looking for a backup, they're going to bring in a guy who sort of fills that role. If they look at it and go, I'm not sure about this, I think it maybe wasn't the Wisconsin offense, then they're going to be looking to add a more top tier guy. Because look, I mean, Florida, for all the different things about being patient and all that sort of stuff, the fan base isn't patient, and 6-6 isn't good enough. And if Mertz leads them to another 6-6 season, the noise in the system is going to get pretty loud. And so, you're going to end up starting DJ Lagway just out of, we need to generate hope for people in 2024. And that's not necessarily the best way to develop a quarterback. So, I do think that they need to get to 7 or 8 wins this year to show some progress and sort of ease the tension on having to make decisions that might be rash coming up in year 3. And if that means bringing in a transfer quarterback to get it done, they're going to do that.
Well, something that may save Billy Napier here, moving on to 6 bits, heading if we are if we do put on another mediocre season here in 2023, the 2024 class is off to an awfully good start here. Will last weekend the Gators continued their hot start on the 2024 trail with the addition of Largo, Florida linebacker Darius Hayes. Hayes is currently a lean prospect. He's 6'4", 210 pounds. Versatile. He comes off the edge, plays a little linebacker, but no doubt will end up packing on more weight by the time he is taking the field in Gainesville. Joins Miles Graham as another elite linebacker prospect. Will, this is a big in-state win for Napier and company, and the foundation of this class is being set much sooner in the cycle than it was last year.
Yeah, well, I mean, I just criticized Napier for not having enough Florida guys on his roster and raiding that top 50. And this is a guy who's definitely in the top 50 in the state of Florida, probably in the top 10 in the state of Florida, out of Largo. So within that sort of 150-mile radius that you got to make sure you lock down. And at linebacker, a position where Florida definitely needs to get younger, definitely needs more depth, and definitely needs more skills. So, yeah, like you said, I mean, the 2024 class, from the standpoint of where they're at, Miles Graham and Adarius Hayes both coming in. Hayes is listed as an edge. A lot of people, when I put that on Twitter, were like, no, his film says middle linebacker. Irrespective, you get him and Miles Graham, two guys who are top 60 guys. Graham's rated 30th right now in this class. Those two guys roaming there at linebacker, and we're not going to struggle to guard some sort of scat back coming out of the backfield against Vanderbilt or against Tennessee. You'll have that locked down. You'll have guys who can fill gaps when it comes to stopping the run. You'll have guys who are instinctive and can get to the quarterback when you bring them on a blitz. So all those sorts of things that Patrick Toney likes to do with the simulated pressures, these guys should all be able to do. And then you cap off the class right now with DJ Lagway, a 5-star prospect. I'm thinking Graham's probably going to creep up into that 5-star range as well. So you end up with Lagway and Graham essentially as 2 5-stars, and Hayes right below that at 61. Yeah, this 2024 class looks awesome right now. The average player rating is like 96, and they really kind of need to end up at 94 at the end. So you can, and this is sort of my entire point about the 2023 class, is if they had guys of Lagway and Graham, those guys ilk in the 2023 class, we'd be looking at it in a very different way, because you'd be saying, look, we got the quarterback and he's a 5-star. We got a linebacker and he's almost a 5-star. And now you've got all these other guys who are ranked 100th to 200th in there. So if they can essentially replicate last year's class, but add maybe 1 or 2 more elite prospects, then yeah, you're sitting there right with the Alabamas and Georgias. And that is going to give you hope, right? That was the problem with Mullen when things started to go south, is that there was no hope that it was going to turn around. He's reached his ceiling. He needs his quarterback to be successful. He refuses to put in the guy who's more gifted to see what he's got. And the recruiting isn't getting any better. What are we waiting around for? If Napier can prove that, look, the first year he was at 88.8 in recruiting. This year he's at 92.1. If next year he's at 94, well, okay, he got up into that elite range, and it's a year later than we would have liked. But I think there you start preaching patience, just because of where the recruiting sits. Now, look, if Lagway and Graham drop a little bit after their senior years in high school, if they don't add anybody else of that ilk, and it sort of ends up in the 8th, 9th, 10th range again, well, then we're going to have a different discussion. But as of right now, where this class sits, very, very impressed with what they've been able to put together with the first 4 guys that they have on there. Even Chauncey Bowens, who's ranked 278th, the running back out of North Palm Beach, Florida. Again, a Florida kid. So they've got a guy who's in the top 50 in the state of Florida at running back, and Kirby Smart's taking helicopters to fly in to visit Chauncey Bowens. So that, if Kirby's coming in special like that to go see a kid, that's somebody you want to hold on to, and probably somebody who's going to be rising in the rankings.
Well, you saw several recruits in the 23 class end up rising fairly significantly this year. Jakeem Jackson, Cameron James, if I'm not mistaken, also rose fairly significantly. So, hey, Napier and his staff, they're definitely identifying that talent early in some instances. So but it is good to see the top guys land early, because the best players want to play with the best players. Is that simple? It's not I know that Georgia and Alabama have other things going on with their recruiting departments, but Billy knows what's going on inside those buildings, because he's shared a building with those guys. And so I don't think that we're really not doing anything that they're doing at this point. So that's the thing that's exciting, seeing the results actually come through and see some of these top guys in early in the class of 2024. Now, of course, we just learned the hard way, doesn't really mean much until they actually sign, right? Well, but it's a good sign early that these guys want to get in, and really, if they're committing this early, it's a sign that Lagway's mentioned it a few times, they want to be a part of helping recruit guys, and joining significant recruits on these visits. Say, yeah, I'm already here, come join us. That's a lot different pitch than bringing in a bunch of guys who aren't committed to the program already.
Yeah, I mean, the Lagway commitment is huge. The
Yeah.
Graham commitment is big, but he's a legacy, so it's not quite as big. But the Lagway commitment is the one, right, where you sit there and say, you've got your anchor,
Yeah.
and now if you don't get it done from here on out, it ain't going to happen, right? Like, you got the 5-star quarterback to commit, who can now recruit everyone else along with the staff. So this is it, right? I mean, in any walk of life, everybody talks about it. The question is, can they actually deliver? Right? Actions speak way louder than words. At this point, it's time to sit back and say, again, top 3 class is the expectation. Top 5 is the minimum. go get it done or don't get it done. But there aren't any more excuses after 2024. If you don't hit that top 5 mark, you're not going to be able to compete with Georgia and Alabama. And the reality is that that's the expectation at Florida. That's why you get paid $7 million. And, you know, good luck to you with with classes that sit in the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th range. It's going to be tough sledding that way. So, look, this is the opportunity for them to prove it. They're proving it thus far. Let's see them finish the deal.
I know you were talking about Billy Napier when you were talking about the $7 million, but it's kind of a touchy number right now if you'd stay off that well. But
I didn't say 13, so
another good sign about bringing in another top rated prospect here. Kind of shows that maybe NIL you learn some lessons, figuring some things out there. So that's also a sign of progress in my mind on that as well. Let's move on here to $1. Orange and Blue game announced for Thursday night, April 13th this year. Second consecutive season is going to be on Thursday night. Last year's move to Thursday night drew 45,000 in the Swamp, and Napier also confirmed that spring ball starts March 4th. So it's been in February here, March 4th. That's good. 4th, that's right around the corner. I'll tell you what, man, it's going to be here as before we know it, and it's going to be quick. I did like the Thursday atmosphere last year. I thought it added a little spice to the game. I did like it for viewing purposes on television as well. This Saturday afternoon, you never know how hot it's going to be in Gainesville in April. Not that that's typically an excuse to play plenty of hot games in the Swamp, but from a fan standpoint, I know it's rough for out of towners, but 45,000 doesn't show that a lot of people had issues getting to the game last year, and I think I like the move. I think it's a good move to do it for another season.
I mean, I don't know. I think obviously I'm an out of towner, so I'm biased, right? Like I would have an opportunity if it was even a Friday night. I'd have an opportunity to get down there maybe on Friday morning, get to the game, and then have the weekend to recover and get back. I can't do that on a Thursday night, or at least I have to take 3 days of vacation to get it done.
Mm-hmm.
And that's rough, right? For anybody who has to come from any length of any space away. And one of the cool parts about the spring game is, at least to me, it always kind of feels like a homecoming. You go to a homecoming game where you're playing the Vanderbilts of the world or whoever, and it's a win, but you go to the tailgate and you have a good time with your friends, and it's the hardcore people who show up, like the people that that you showed up, the people that you went to the homecoming game with when you were a student, right? Sort of the same atmosphere. There's always a baseball game and a football or a basketball game going on at the same time. And hey, the basketball team just beat Tennessee, so looking up there as well. Yeah, I mean, I just look at it and I go, the Saturday aspect of things, like there's a rhythm. It's sort of the same reason that the Monday night national championship game seems so weird, right? Because I'm so used to watching a Saturday night game, and then sort of the rhythm of waking up on Sunday and going to church and the things that we do on Sunday, that when it's a Monday night game, it's just a little bit weird. Same thing with I felt that way about Florida State being on the Friday night, right? That I stayed up, I finished my post game article, and all of a sudden I'm sitting there going, "What, Saturday? What's going on here?" So, so it's strange. There's no doubt that it's strange. I understand why people are upset. I think they're perfectly within their rights to be upset. I think these decisions are not made because of the fans. I think, and we need to realize that that's the way college football is. College football is driven by television dollars. That is what it's driven by. And so if the SEC network or ESPN says, we want you to do this on Thursday night, well, look, you're going to do it on Thursday night because that's when they want it. The night game is cool for the players, especially the recruits who are coming. It's also good from the standpoint of it's kind of a reward to play under the lights after getting beaten up in the heat for a month in spring camp. And in terms of what you see in these games, it's usually relatively minimal. Last year, I think the main thing we learned was that Anthony Richardson was much, much better than Jack Miller. And then we saw that on the field, and Richardson wasn't great the entire season. He was great in spurts, and then he was really bad in spurts, but he wasn't great the entire time. But certainly what we saw against Oregon State sort of suggests that he was better than Jack Miller. So I think that's probably the thing you're really looking for if you're watching the spring game, whether it's on TV or whether it's live, is how does Graham Mertz look compared to Jack Miller? How does Jack Miller look compared to Jack Miller from last year? And those are sort of the takeaways from the game. But look, I mean, the last time I went to a spring game, I brought my kid down there, and it was about going to a game, and it was about family. It wasn't about watching the game specifically. I think a lot of people do that, right? Because it's free, because it's It's an opportunity to take someone there who maybe is too young to go into a game that you really care about. Like, he asked me to take him to the bathroom and get him some food right as the opening kickoff was going. I asked him for like every 5 minutes for a half hour leading up to the game whether he had to go to the bathroom, and he didn't at all until the kickoff was coming. So, when you got to take a kid like that who's not necessarily zoned in on the game, but you want to have the experience with him. That's what the spring game is
It's
for.
his
So
spring game too. He's learning too.
there you go. So,
You know.
hey, so hopefully what this really means is that a bunch of people in Gainesville have the opportunity to do that. But yeah, it limits the people who can travel in. I understand why people who are ways away are not thrilled with the idea, but I also understand why it exists. And quite honestly, if I'm all that mad about a spring game in terms of timing and those sorts of things, then as long as they don't have like former players coming out and catching bombs on the side after not running a route, I'm fine. That annoyed me a few years ago, but as long as they don't do that, I'll be fine.
We'll keep that alive for another year. Will, good job. All right, that's our episode of Stand Up and Holler tonight. I'm Nick Knudsen here, joined by Will Miles. Thanks for joining, everybody. We'll see y'all next week. Until then, go Gators. Thank you for watching this episode of Stand Up and Holler. Be sure to subscribe to the Read and Reaction YouTube channel. Join our Patreon community at Read and Reaction for bonus content each week. And check out our website at readandreaction.com. I'm Nick Knudsen, joined by Will Miles, and as always, go Gators.